Okay, so we wanted to kind of discuss collaboration and how we work collaboratively. So I'm really interested to hear from Susanna, because I know you do a lot of collaborative work. In how do you think kind of influences the work you make, and how does it maybe differ from the work you do on your own? And maybe, yeah, you want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so I have to say I'm drawn really strongly to collaborative projects, and always have been. I use my work as a clinical arts therapist and then also as a writer. So you mentioned earlier the project, The Ruins. That was a project with a contemporary artist, a French artist, Anne-Sophie Ducas. And what I find very interesting in collaborations is I think one has to set up a framework, but it's very interesting, like when you collaborate, say, with a writer and a visual artist, there's almost this notion of illustration that can come in, which is almost a very reducing, I think. Not there's some very interesting illustration, but the idea that you'd start with a similar theme and then you work together. And with Anne-Sophie, it was a really extraordinary experience because she uses contemporary drawing and she'd drawn a series of imaginary ruins. And when I saw them, I then imagined a short story, I'll put the link up in the notes, which was then published, which was about a woman who collected these worlds. It was a kind of Borges type story. And then the most extraordinary thing happened is that in my story, this old woman kept all of these ruins in a chest. And then Anne-Sophie made the chest from my story. So she created a fictional object that I never saw during the process that she created it. And then we did a performance together, which included me discovering the box, which as a writer is a completely extraordinary experience, because what one imagines in a fiction, particularly in that type of fiction, to actually then have it produced in reality was an incredible experience. So I'd say it just takes you, and what was extraordinary is she actually made something that was very, very, and she used objects that I gave her that had also belonged to my family. And it was a really extraordinary emotional experience to do the performance on the day and have that object revealed. So how would I say it changed the work? Because I think it's the very, the letting go, I think, of the kind of control you have over the process. I think there's very much a sense of letting go of that kind of universe that you put yourself in, particularly as a writer when you're writing a novel, or you have that kind of global vision. And this sudden moment where a kind of porosity, I think, where you're kind of opening yourself up to what that person's going to bring into your work, and they're opening themselves up to you.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And how do you think I know you do a lot of work with non-verbal communication with your art therapy, and how do you think non-verbal communication is kind of like more or as powerful as verbal communication, and how can we use it in interesting ways?
That's a big question. Yeah, so I worked for years with children on the spectrum, and I think for me, one of the important things to understand about nonverbal communication is it's about 80% or 90% of communication is nonverbal. So as we're all looking at each other, how we're holding our backs, what our faces, our expressions, our hands moving, that's about 50-60%. And then there's the tone of our voice, how we're articulating. If I start to talk to you really loudly, or if my voice is very high pitched, all of those things will be actually stronger than the words. And what I find absolutely extraordinary is there's a quote from Bachelard, which is all about imagination. And he says, imagination isn't necessarily inventing things, it's how we change the reality we have. And when I've worked extensively with non-verbal people who are non-verbal, I think there's a quality and a richness in the type of expression they can have, where I think that in that particular vein of work, you allow a lot of the children I used to work with were children who were excluded from all workshops, like therapy type work, because they were seen as non-verbal. And I used to collate these groups with all of these kids who'd been kind of kicked out. And yeah, so I think it's the depth of what that is, and realizing what sensorial beings we are. So for example, at the moment in COVID, we are all deprived of touch. And I gave a performance at a cabaret about it recently. And that touch is part of nonverbal communication. Your skin is 2 meters squared. It's the biggest sense organ we have. And I think it's that physicality. And to make the link with Dadaism, one of their biggest things was performance, and the kind of, particularly in the Cabaret Voltaire, this kind of live interaction that we can have. So yeah, that's a, I could talk about that for ages.
So just moving on, taking that idea of space a little bit, and this is probably a question for all of our speakers, as well as Sudana. But Dadis, I always think of them as kind of subverting the idea of space. So I'm just thinking of the Baroness Elsa as one example. Like, there was no distinction between private space, public space, artistic space. You know, she wore her art, she took it out on the streets of New York. And obviously at the moment with COVID, we are all having to completely redefine what we think of as space. Like, not only in terms of having to keep away from other people, but also a lot of people have been working from home. So then what is your workspace? What's your private space? And as I say, it's kind of a question for everybody really. But how do you feel like that shifting of space has affected your work over the past couple of months? And also whether you feel like there's positives to be gained from those new ideas of space, whether there's things that you would actually take forward from it. Does anybody want to start?
I'll start briefly. I feel like things like this type of connection are quite extraordinary. And the resilience of the human spirit to keep on being kind of creative and creating these type of spaces, which we're doing virtually at the moment. I think they're a huge sign of that. Obviously, these type of virtual spaces have their limitations, but I think there's a resourcefulness in our use of space on a positive level that's coming on through this experience of confinement.
Hi, I think I'm really conscious of just physical space, because I've been trying to research Hannah Höch as much as possible, and just wondering about how much physical space she needed for her collages. And then also because this is coming after, like, I was watching a documentary on James Joyce the other day, and I was steaming because the time that he spent in Switzerland and stuff, like, you know, he's like really close to, yeah, everyone we're talking about. But I was just outraged because he had like more than a room of one's own. He had like everything done for him: laundry, cooking, you know. When we're looking at the women of Dada, like the amount of things that they had to get through in order to just like, I mean, yeah, because I'm obsessed with Virginia Woolf, but like just having more than a room of one's, less than a room of one's own, just to have a desk, I just think is just so, it's so like tragic that in actual fact, I'm like going back to the basics of space. That's really, I think, what we're fighting for. And then not just the space to create, but also the space to maintain and to archive, like the work that's been kept and the effort that's been put into, maintaining a space for this work to be preserved. Like for me, as a Black woman of the diaspora, like I'm just like really aware of how much of my culture ancestrally has been lost, and also like how it's made it easier for colonialists and neo-colonialists to invade that space and to appropriate, you know, the theft of space, and has like left like a cognitive void. So like, yeah, because of that erasure, you're kind of like, even if you're there and you're present, you're seen as like just an empty space, you know, as, you know, all of our, like our whole continents were and stuff. So yeah, that's wild and rambling, but I don't feel like that's my fault.
Blame James Joyce.
I'm sure that's kind of what's inculcated into me and being worked on. Exactly.
Cool. We can blame James Joyce for a lot of things. Miriam, do you have anything to add?
About the spaces we're working in. I mean, I'm struggling to have a space at the moment that isn't, domestic on the whole, just to have somewhere else. I think with thinking about sculpture, it is all about space, public, well, where it's shown. Is it public? Is it private? Should we all have access to it? And I think that's been pretty important just lately. Where does sculpture fit into public space? What's it for? But again, I'm rambling even worse. I have to think about this one. Sorry.
Can I validate your rambling? Because I feel when you're talking about...
That's what this space is for. Everybody can ramble as much as they like.
Lift each other up. But yeah, as soon as you mentioned statues, I thought of the Colston statue being taken down in Bristol, and you know, even though I think like it's being sensationalized, because I think the map of statue removal and stuff reveals that, you know, a lot of them were planned to be taken down anyway and things. And when I saw that, I was gleeful, I can't pretend, but also like seeing the far right protest the following weekend, and where that gentleman was like urinating on that police statue, I feel like that's really close to there's that statue like just for women of World War II, I think, and there's no faces or whatever, it's just like coats and hats, and like I just feel like that even in spite of it being, you know, like a mainstream news story, I feel like the discussion around like women in public space and who we choose to honor is still really narrow and stuff. And like, it feels like with like after we got like Jane Austen onto the £10 note, I feel like it's kind of like, okay, it's like, you know, leave them for a little bit, because as far as I'm aware, I don't know of many like I know that there's Edith Cavell in Trafalgar Square. I'm not sure if that the black nurse Marie, I've forgotten her name, but yeah, the one who fought in the Crimean War and stuff. Yeah, Mary Seacole, that's it, excuse me. Oh, my mum would kill me, don't tell her. But yeah, I'm just like, I think it's such a shame that it's that about the disparity, and like there's such a peltry of like statues of women, and I don't really hear of anyone discussing how to redress that balance for the future. So yeah, just thoughts.
I think women actually in any representation are pretty poorly served. I mean, there are only 21 paintings of by women in the National Gallery of their thousands. There's only a handful of statues in the whole of London of women. And if you discount all those that are just mythological figures, that's the thing. Most of the representations of women, you know, Alos, Gorilla Girls, are nude and are not individuals. They represent something, they're allegorical. So you're distanced from everything anyway, from those that are there. And I think it's going to get worse once our public spaces open more and all the cultural venues are going to go to the wall. We're going to have even less space to inhabit in a kind of culturally meaningful way.
Yeah, I'm just kind of joining in that, and I'm thinking about whether or not that made me think of violence against women in the street. And the fear of women walking in the street. I remember when I was younger and I used to go out clubbing, and I used to go out on my own sometimes clubbing, and then I'd walk home on my own. And it was such a sense of freedom. And I now have 3 daughters, and wanting for them to be safe, but then be in those spaces, which are obviously potentially quite dangerous spaces. And I'm wondering whether the kind of political nature of representation in space actually has a direct, and I'm sure it does, link to actually how we then behave in that space, in the sense that if there were these representations of us in the space, would the behavior of people in that space alter? And that's just a question that floated into my mind.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually.
What we thought we'd do for the second one, am I on mute or can everybody hear me? No, I'm not on mute. Is kind of what we wanted to do in this session was to start thinking about a modern day manifesto for a new kind of avant-garde, because obviously we're all here, we all know that there's so much to admire about Dada and the avant-garde movement as it was, but that there was also a lot not to admire, and a lot of things that if we were to take it forward today, we probably wouldn't want to include, we would want to put right, as it were, as far as we can. So kind of what we wanted to do in this session was to start thinking about a modern day manifesto for the avant-garde, thinking about things that we would want to include in that. So for a second writing activity, if you scroll right up to I'm saying the top of the Google Sheet. It might not be at the top of the Google Sheet anymore, but there are some ideas on there about kind of manifesto ideas, and some quotes from Baroness Elsa and from Mina Loy. And I think there was Mina Loy's manifestos circulating as well. So we thought we could take those as a starting point, perhaps pick a phrase from some of the poetry that came out of the first activity and use it to create your own part of a modern day manifesto. So again, we've probably got about 15 minutes, Rochelle, do you think?
Yeah.
Cool.